Okay, I think we're going to start. Thank you for coming. Welcome, everyone, and thank you. My name is Simone Kremko, and I'm a librarian here at the Sonoma County History and Genealogy Library. I'm joined by my co-host and colleague, Marshall McGraw, who's helping to manage this webinar behind the scenes. Before we start, this session will be recorded and will become available on the library's YouTube channel. Also, please mute yourself and turn your video off. The chat is open, and if you have any questions, we will have a 10 to 15-minute Q&A at the end of the presentation. We will only be taking questions from the chat, so feel free to submit them into the chat towards the end of the talk. We are very excited today to have Gena Philibert-Ortega with us tonight. Gena is an author, researcher, and instructor specializing in the use of social history and material culture to tell the story of historical women's lives. She holds 2 master's degrees, one in psychology, women's studies, and the other in religion. A highly sought after instructor, Gena has taught material culture and social history at the Genealogical Research Institute of Pittsburgh and the Salt Lake Institute of Genealogy, and is a frequent presenter at seminars and conferences. Tonight's presentation will explore the unique challenges and resources for navigating the overlooked institutions of state hospitals and asylums. Gena will discuss strategies for locating records and present social history sources for uncovering the daily lives of patients so you can tell a family history story that offers a deeper understanding of their lives. And Gena, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Oh, sorry, I had my mute on. Okay, let me start again. Sorry about that. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Simone, for introducing me. It's great to be here tonight. We're going to be talking about a topic that I think is important to a lot of people because they come across this in their family history and they're not really sure what to do. It's a more difficult research. It is sometimes very frustrating. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about the history of people and asylums, and later we would call those state hospitals or psychiatric hospitals or mental health facilities, and then get into the resources and how to tell that story by combining not just the story of the individual, but also the story of where they were. Now, I come at this from a very personal experience. In fact, I have a few people who were institutionalized. Now, this is a 20th century example, but it's one I wanted to give just to kind of give you a taste before we go back in time. This on the left is my great-great-grandmother, Melinda Randall Montgomery Bean, and she was institutionalized during the World War II years for dementia. Now, her family could not take care of her. One of her grandchildren told me that people were taking advantage of her. They were stealing her money. They were tricking her. They were doing all kinds of things that happens with elder abuse. So she ended up in the Oregon State Hospital. Now, I found this out originally from her death certificate. So here's her death certificate on the right-hand side. On the left is a picture of her with one of her children. And it says on there that she died at Oregon State Hospital in Salem, Oregon. If you look towards the bottom of the left-hand column, it says the informant was OSH Records, Oregon State Hospital Records. Her family, this is during World War II, gas is rationed, so they could not go visit her. And so she died alone. And the funeral was not attended by anyone either because of gas rationing. And her family lived far away from Oregon. Most of them lived in California at the time. So that's what kind of got me set to looking and seeing what more could I find out about her and her stay. Now, her research has entailed everything from Oregon State Archives and their admittance logs to talking to family members, to looking in newspapers and seeing what was it like to live at the Oregon State Hospital when she was there. Now, Oregon State Hospital, this is what it looked like at one time. And we're actually going to talk about this look, this kind of building. There's actually a name for that. And you don't see these too often anymore because over time they have been sometimes torn down or they've been abandoned. Some of these facilities are still state hospitals today, and they needed things that were more updated. So sometimes this look is, like I said, destroyed, or there's a new type of building that's built over it. Now, over time, with people who were deemed mentally unhealthy, there has been this history of ill treatment, right? So we see that the first asylums in the United States come about in the late 18th century, and they are not great places to be. There's only a few of them. We know that there were places also in England and other countries. A lot of the idea has to do with that people who are mentally ill because of things like maybe demon possession. There's not a lot of medical stuff going around to really understand what's going on. But in the 18th century and the 19th century, we get to this idea of moral treatment, where the idea is that if people were treated a certain way, they had access to, nice grounds, nice places to walk, sunlight, fresh air, kind of like what that hospital would give you. Even inside, there's lots of light. There's different rooms that people could get together and they could talk and they could, have conversations and eat together, and beautiful grounds. That would help people become well and they could be discharged from the facility. So we see this happening in the 19th century where there's this belief. Now, that doesn't mean that people aren't mistreated and that they aren't in horrible conditions. But what it means is that over time, we see different attitudes towards mental health. So basically, in 1812, Benjamin Rush, who is kind of the father of American psychiatry, calls for humane treatment of the mentally ill. Now, he's not the only one. Dorothea Dix is also out there saying we've got to treat mentally ill people better than this, and that's going to help them to be discharged, to go back to their families, to lead their lives. In 1844, the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institute for Insane is founded. This is the precursor to the American Psychiatric Association. Now, during the 17th, or 18th century, 19th century, early to mid 19th century, there is really not good psychiatry. There's no medications. There's just ideas about what treatment could be done and what couldn't be done. Now, with people asking that things change, we get something called the Kirkbride Plan. This is named after one of the early American psychiatrists, and his idea was to build these buildings that look exactly like this, where they have this, entrance hall, this kind of grand hall, and there's different wards going out. And you have patients who live in these different wards. They may have a communal space. So they have places to roam, they have all of that. They're not being locked up in basements. They've got fresh air, they've got access to activities. They're outside in the gardens, gardening or farming. They're doing things. Now, the first U.S. asylum that really is a state hospital is Utica. Now, there are other facilities prior to that in the US, but this is kind of considered the first state hospital. Now, Napa State Hospital, which some of you may be familiar with, opens in 1875. And if you had somebody who was at Napa State Hospital, there's tons of information about that facility online. Now, in Sonoma in 1883, the California Home for the Care and Training of Feeble-Minded Children is opened. Now, that will change over time. And in fact, keep the word feeble-minded in your head, because we're going to talk about that in a second. Then we start seeing psychiatry coming in, and Freud and others are publishing about psychiatry. Now, obviously, their ideas are very antiquated, and we know that some of their ideas are just nonsense, but that is the precursor to what we see later. Now, what happens in the 20th century, in the start of the 20th century, is that eugenics comes to play. So we go from, earlier times where it's because Satan is possessing you or there's just something wrong with you, to this feeling that, okay, over time you're going to get better. You just need, some sunshine and fresh air and that kind of thing. To, no, it's because you have your family is no good and they shouldn't be having children, and you're feeble-minded, you're unfit, and it has to do with eugenics. And we all know where eugenics goes once we get into World War II. But you've got to know that in the United States, eugenics was a big deal, and it was a big deal when we look at state hospitals, because it's through the ideas of eugenicists that's where we get people who are admitted to state hospitals and who are treated in certain ways, including being sterilized. California is one of the first states to pass a law on sterilization. Other states do this too. And the idea is that we need to sterilize anybody who is unfit or feeble-minded, to stop people who should not be procreating from procreating. And so this was done in state hospitals. And usually you were told that if you allowed them to sterilize you, you could be released. This would have also been done to even younger people, teenagers who were institutionalized. Now, let's touch a little bit on women and asylums, because this is something that a lot of people will find with their family history. So when we think about women being institutionalized, why? Why are they institutionalized? Well, you have to think about, when we look at the 18th century, the 19th century, maybe early 20th century, what rights do women have? Now, we know until about 1850, when women start getting the Married Women's Property Acts, and they start to be allowed to own land, they start to be able to have custody of their own children, that kind of thing, they start getting some rights. But prior to that, and depending on what state you're in, husbands had total rights, and we call that coverture. That is based on a law that said that when a husband and wife are married, that the husband has all the legal rights and the wife is covered by him. So there's no reason for her to vote, for example, or to serve on a jury, to sue, to do any of these things, because her husband does it for her. Now, if you don't have a husband, then that would be your father or whoever's your male guardian. So when we look at that, we find that husbands and fathers would institutionalize their daughters, their sisters, their wives, their mothers, when we look at Mary Todd Lincoln, because they were not maybe acting in what they considered proper roles, proper gender stereotype roles. Maybe they were not doing what they were told. Maybe they were asserting their rights. Maybe they wanted to vote, for example. So those kinds of things would happen, and we're going to look at one example. So you got to look at who has the power and who has, the ability to do that. And that's why we see sometimes women who are institutionalized. And I can tell you, a while back, I had contacted one of my local state hospitals because I was looking for some records that would have been over 100 years old. And they told me, oh, you can't have them because of HIPAA, which is one of the things we're told. But what she did tell me was that they had destroyed most of the records. So even if I could get them, they were destroyed. But that she was so shocked that a lot of women, especially in the early 20th century, were institutionalized by husbands who basically dropped them off and then, I guess, went off and got new wives. So that did happen, and that has to do with the power that husbands had over their wives. Now, we're starting to be alerted to the problems with facilities with people like Nellie Bly. Now, you may have heard of Nellie Bly. You may have heard about her trip around the world in 80 days. She actually also was a journalist during World War I. She did a lot of important work that we sometimes don't think about in today's world. But one of her first jobs was to go into Blackwell's Island Asylum and to see how easy it was for her to be institutionalized. Now, the problem was she couldn't get out when she was in because they did not believe that she was not mentally ill. So she said about this experience, but here was a woman taken without her own consent for the free world to an asylum and there given no chance to prove her sanity. Confined most probably for life behind asylum bars without ever being told in her language the why and wherefore, compare this with a criminal who is given every chance to prove his innocence. Who would not rather be a murderer and take the chance for life than be declared insane without hope of escape? So Nellie Bly wrote about her experiences in 10 Days in a Madhouse. She basically is institutionalized to get a story and to show what is happening to the women who are institutionalized there. And then the doctors don't believe that she's sane, and her editor finally had to come and get her out. So she showed a lot of things. She showed about the treatment of women, about women who were there who shouldn't have been there, and the fact that you couldn't get out once you were in. Now, more recently, we know that this was an issue on many fronts, and we know this from this book called The Woman They Could Not Silence by Kate Moore. Now, this is a book that was published a few years ago. It's about the story of Elizabeth Packard, who, like Nellie Bly, told her story. Now, unlike Nellie Bly, Elizabeth Packard was a wife and a mother. And her husband was very angry with her because she had different religious beliefs than he did, and he was a minister. He had her institutionalized. Now, he was able to do this by telling them what he thought about her insubordination. He paid for her institutionalization, which helped. That was one way that men institutionalized their wives, is they paid for it. She eventually is able to get out and take him to court, and she is deemed not mentally ill. However, when she is out and safe from all of this, she had no right of custody for her children. So she goes about fighting for women who are institutionalized, but also for women who don't have rights over their children. Now, in this book, it talks about this happens in Illinois, and it talks about the conditions of that hospital. In fact, it's kind of interesting. The doctor who was in charge, not a psychiatrist, and I think a later mental health hospital was named after him, actually. One of the things that she points out when she goes on speaking tours and stuff, prior to her death, was that there were other women there who were not mentally ill, but that were there at the whim of their husbands. So it's a really good book to look at to get an idea about your own family history story. Now, I want to circle back to the words feeble-minded, moron. We also would call people idiots and imbeciles. Those are all words that come out of eugenics. Now, feeble-minded, it was a word to use for people who did not have high IQ scores that showed some kind of abnormal behavior. They were seen as people who were promiscuous. This is one of the issues with eugenics is, you know, you're seen to have issues if you are perhaps promiscuous or thought to be promiscuous. So you might be more inclined to criminal behavior. They even diagnosed feeble-mindedness with infants. There's a very famous case where they did that. It was a reason to have forced sterilization. And moron is another term that was coined by Henry Goddard. He was one of the pioneers in eugenics, and it just means that you were dull. And like I said, they also had words for idiot, imbecile. That is why you're going to see those kinds of words as you do this type of research. It has a very specific meaning, and so we need to keep that in mind. And it would have a specific meaning in a specific time period. Okay, now one of the things that you can find online as you're looking for information about asylums are annual reports. Those are going to be available on digitized book websites like Google Books, Internet Archive, that kind of thing. So here's an example from 1863, and these are some of the reasons that men and women were institutionalized. And so you can see the top reason was unknown, but then there was intemperance. So alcoholism was something, alcohol and drugs was one of the reasons. But then there's disappointed love, injury of their head, domestic affliction, illness, studying the scriptures too much, mental anxiety, religious excitement, spiritual wrappings, jealousy. So you can see some of these things are things that you wouldn't consider to be what you would be institutionalized for today. Epilepsy, lactation. I think a lot of pregnant women and women who have given birth probably would be lactating. So some of these reasons are just stuff that we don't see today. There are also excuses in some cases. Some of you have probably seen the tables where they talk about novel reading as one reason to go ahead and institutionalize women. This is another table, and these are for the Jacksonville Asylum. This is in Kate Moore's book, The Woman They Could Not Silence, and it includes novel reading. And then you've got things like epilepsy, paralysis, sunstroke, a more disappointed love, hard study. It was believed that women who studied or read too much, that would cause them problems. It caused them things like hysteria. So change of life, menopause. So there's lots of reasons why somebody could be admitted. Some of it would just be, whatever excuse, especially if a husband was trying to dump his wife off at the institution. Now, I want to talk a little bit and kind of, people often talk about asylums, but there were other places that people ended up because asylums were often full, even when they were those big, huge Victorian kind of buildings. They often became full very quickly. In fact, Napa, I think is it Napa or Sonoma? Napa, I think, was built because Stockton, the asylum there, was full. And so they had to build another one. So that would have happened. So other places would have taken people who needed mental health treatment, but there was no room. So one place was the almshouse. Now, Simone and I were talking about earlier, yes, there were almshouses in the United States. Sometimes these are called poor farms, but they date back to colonial days. They were used as a dumping ground for the mentally ill, epileptics, mentally retarded, the blind, deaf, dumb, crippled, TB, older people, vagrants, criminals, prostitutes, unmarried mothers, and abandoned and neglected children. So, an almshouse, even though that's a place for the impoverished, you could be impoverished for many different reasons, including mental health reasons. Now, one of the places that we find information about asylums, about even individual stories, is historical newspapers. So, for example, this is one from the Oakland Tribune from 1900 that talks about Mrs. Sarah Loughran, that she was an unfortunate cripple who was refused succor by her unnatural brother. And so she had to go back to the almshouse. So, yes, people end up in the almshouse because they're poor, but people who have mental health issues also end up in other places besides the asylum because of overcrowding. So, for example, the San Francisco City and County Almshouse history. Now, they opened in 1867. You can see the building is very similar to what we see in those Victorian asylums. They initially are segregated. They don't allow the Chinese or African Americans to come in. They have about 800 to 900 people. A fifth of those are women. They do have a women's hospital on grounds. Now, the difference between an asylum and an almshouse is that you could be discharged upon request. So, unlike an asylum where most likely you're not being discharged unless they decide you are or your family decides, the almshouse, if you say, okay, I'm good, I've got some money, I'm going to go over to my daughter's house, whatever, they let you go. Like an asylum, the people there are given jobs to do, such as farming or taking care of animals or cleaning or sewing. And so it's not unusual for these almshouses to take asylum patients and to eventually become a hospital. And in the 1920s, this actually does become Laguna Honda Hospital. Now, one of the reasons we know that almshouses, besides that definition I read, do include people who were institutionalized in asylums or should have been, is this study that was done that was published in 1895 by Mary Roberts Smith, and she was a professor over at Stanford. And so she does a look at people in the almshouse, and she says, she looks at the women. She says the majority are more or less feeble-minded. So remember, that's a eugenics word, deficient or erratic in memory. 88% are illiterate and 83% are immigrants. So what happens is with the asylums is we've got this great idea about having the asylums on these beautiful grounds that people can get fresh air and they can walk around and they can garden and they can do all this stuff. But they increasingly become crowded. And they become crowded because of immigrants who are sent there for various reasons that may have nothing to do with mental health. They are crowded because all kinds of people are sent there who aren't mentally ill. They get crowded and they become difficult. The buildings themselves, because they're so big and require so much maintenance, they become problems. And so eventually we see that model kind of going away and more what we would consider modern day hospitals are being built. Now, just to show you Mary Roberts Smith, this is one of her tables. She doesn't name the people in the almshouse. She numbers them, but you might be able to tell if you knew your person was in there during this time period. She talks about their ancestry, their education, their habits. She gives her background story. And so some of these are basically that, she drank. That was something you would end up in an asylum for, or that a husband left her with no money, or that she has some sort of mental illness. So she gives all the different reasons that women found themselves in the almshouse. It's just fascinating. The reason I'm showing this and talking about almshouses is because I want you to kind of think more about that it wasn't just the asylums that people would be sent to. The other thing is this article, this study was found in JSTOR. So JSTOR, if you're not familiar. So people did studies on people in asylums and almshouses, and that's a great way to get information. Now, why is this research so difficult? Really, it's because it's a hidden history. There's lack of access to records, and once again, that's a time and place issue. And sometimes people died there, and there's burials on grounds. And sometimes those burials are not well marked, if at all. So literally a person could go into a place and never be heard from again. And you might not have any idea what became of them. Now, my ancestor who was at Oregon State Hospital was not, they're basically usually cremated there at the hospital. She had family that made sure she was transferred, picked up by a funeral home, and that her remains were buried at a local city cemetery. But that doesn't happen for everybody. Now, there are people today who are trying to bring to the forefront these types of stories and trying to connect families with their loved ones, their family who were in these facilities. One example is Oregon State Hospital. They have a website where you can look through a database of unclaimed cremains. And they have the names and the information, and they have the cremains there at the facility that you can go and have buried somewhere if you want. So that is one of the things they're doing. Lots of places are doing similar types of projects. This is what you can see at the top there. This is what the database looks like. It's first and last name. It's, no, I didn't put it down. It's when they entered and when they passed. So, and then it talks about how you can claim the remains and how you can go from there. Now, of course, we're genealogists. We're used to finding burials. And so one of the places you might find a burial is find a grave. But, and here's an example. This is from Pilgrim State Hospital in New York. Now, one of my cousins, her grandmother actually was forcibly institutionalized here. She passed here, and she was given an autopsy where they decided, because she didn't speak English, she was an immigrant, that she was crazy and she had some things wrong with her brain and all of that, which was probably just the fact that they didn't understand her. Now, notice what happens when you search for names in this hospital. In fact, her grandmother was buried at this hospital, but she was never able to find her because this is what the burials look like. It's a little cement stone. It has the first initial, last name, and their patient number, and that's it. So sometimes in these cases, these histories become hidden because either they are buried under a number or with so little information. In the case of my cousin's grandmother, when she went there to look for her burial, they told her they didn't know what she was talking about, that there was no cemetery on grounds. She had to flag down a maintenance person who showed her where the cemetery was. Okay. Let's talk about resources and how to research individuals, but also the history of the place. Now, we're genealogists. We like databases. We like things online. We like Ancestry. And yes, there actually, for California, is a database of state hospital records. Now, keep this in mind. This is one database. It's for California. It's from 1856 to 1923. It's from the state archives, and it has Stockton, Sonoma, and Mendocino, and that's it. You can browse the collection or you can search it. Oh, sorry about that. They do have admission records. They have other kinds of case files. It's a really interesting database, but like I said, it's only 3 hospitals. It's for a very specific time period. Most of the time, you are not going to find information like this. It's going to be a lot harder to find. So we need to think about what might exist. Now, it might exist for individuals. And then, like I said, you might have to do research for the place. So individuals, you might have something that's a home source that tells you they were institutionalized. There might be censuses, hospital records, court records, newspapers, and cemetery records. If we're looking at researching the place as well, we're going to look at newspapers. Remember, you can search historical newspapers for the names of places, not just the names of people. We're going to look at annual reports of the institution, any histories that were written, and use images to help tell the story. Now, the census, obviously after 1850, we have in the US an every name census. Hospitals, other institutions, and their inhabitants are enumerated in those census schedules. Remember that residents will be listed as inmates. And you might want to use the browse or the film strip feature to browse page by page to see what everybody is listed. So this is an example. This is from 1900 from the U.S. City and County Almshouse for San Francisco. And you can see that you've got the name of the person, they're an inmate, and then you have their birthday. You've got all the stuff you would expect, including the occupation they had when they entered the asylum. And look, there's a lot of people who, dressmakers, carpenters, servants, laborers, teamsters, so lots of different kinds of occupations. Going through page by page is going to help you see who the staff were, who the residents were, and kind of see what's going on in that place and time. Now, there's also the 1880 Federal Census Schedule of Defective, Dependent, and Delinquent Classes. So this is also on Ancestry. If you go to that page, so you go to Ancestry, go to US Census, then you click on this database, you get to the page that is the search engine for that database. Scroll down, and there is all the information about that database. Now, this was provided by, I think, the New York State Library, but as you can see, it includes other states, not all states, but other states, including California as well. So take a look at it. I would heavily suggest browsing and looking at that film strip to see how it's different depending on what state and what was listed. Now, each page has 4 sections. This is just showing you the top 2 sections. You can see there on the left is deaf mutes. Over here on the right is people who were at the asylum. In fact, they were at Sonoma Asylum, and it says there, oh, and Napa Asylum. So you have the blind, and then you have the other, you have another category. So take a look at these. This can help you, especially if you can't find somebody with their family. This might be where they're at. Now, I'll tell you, when we talk about almshouses or poor farms, even small poor farms where definitely people might have found themselves if they had some mental illness, those would be found in the U.S. federal census in as well. One of my female ancestors ran a poor farm, and so they were listed in the census living with her, and the poor farm was her house. So there, I just blew it up for you just a little bit so you can see there. You've got the name, you've got the town where they're typically a resident, what their disease is. The first person, Mary, she's got dementia. The next person has melancholy. So they're depressed. And then those 3 are at Napa Asylum. There are other types of censuses and places to find censuses. New York State Archives, for example, has this section on almshouse and poorhouse censuses. So New York State has a state census and the federal census, so you might want to take a look. Always ask yourself, where am I researching and what archives and libraries exist? So for example, if I go to Ancestry and I go look at the US, I look at New York and then census, there's the census of inmates in almshouses and poorhouses. Ancestry has it as well. So it always is a good idea to look at the card catalog for Ancestry or the specific states. Now, before we leave the census, census reports were done, publications were done. You can find this on the US Census Bureau in the publications or library section. And what they would do is they would do census results and then they would tabulate them. And so here's the insane in hospitals from 1900. So that might also give you some information as you learn more about the asylum and your person's stay in the asylum. Now, I talked about annual reports. There's also histories. I would highly suggest looking at Google Books, Internet Archive, and HathiTrust for those. Don't enter your ancestor's name. Enter the place that they were staying. Make it simple. So Sonoma Asylum might be enough. Obviously, if you're looking into the 1900s, you might have to put state hospital because language changes. And so you might have to look at what were they called throughout time? What was their history? So for example, here's one of those reports. So this was a report of the directors from 1873 for Napa State Asylum for the Insane. And so you can read there, and usually there'll be statistics in there and who's working there and what's happening. This won't be a list of everybody who is confined to that, but it will give you statistics. Now, because these are typically older, they're going to be free. And so you can download them as a PDF for free. This is an example from San Francisco, their municipal reports, which includes, it's the Board of Supervisors, which also includes some information about county-run programs. And then on Internet Archive, the ebooks and texts, that's where you're going to find things about almshouses and asylums as well. If you do a general search like I did here for almshouse, I got all kinds of things from registers to reports to maps to everything. Sometimes we have to start broad and then narrow. So for example, this is from what us Californians would say Peabody, but I know in Massachusetts they call it Peabody. Almshouse from 1868 to 1905. It actually is a register and it has names when they were admitted and discharged. Notice that's right there at that ledger there in kind of the middle of my screen. So you can find some genealogical relevant records on Internet Archive. It just matters who's uploading them. Now, people who are institutionalized in an asylum or a state hospital are done so usually through the court process. So why they would stay for a longer period of time would typically be something that would be a court action, not all the time, depending on the time period, but that might be something to look at. What court records might exist, that might be easier to get a hold of than a hospital record. Sometimes this is an action that was done in the probate courts, depending on what state you're researching. You just need to know where those records would be stored, whether they would be off-site or at the courthouse. Now, just kind of in closing, think about, like I said before, what records might exist and where they might exist. When we think about things like reports and histories, we want to think about libraries. public, private, academic, especially. State libraries are going to be helpful. There is information about asylums through Library of Congress. Genealogy libraries are going to have information depending on who they are and what they have as digitized works like Family Search. You can do a search on WorldCat to get an idea of what's out there. Once again, you want to search by the name of the asylum or the words asylum or almshouse. So for example, on WorldCat, you can do a search on theses and dissertations. And when I did a search on asylums, I found this dissertation about Toronto, Canada's lunatic asylum in context 1830 to 1882. So this would be great information if you were doing research on that asylum, and it would have a bibliography with additional places to search. Don't forget state library and state archives, because often state archives are going to have these records. In the case of California, we saw that set that was available through Ancestry. With my Oregon State Archives research, there was an admitting log. They wouldn't give me the actual files, but there was a log that showed when my female ancestor entered, and well, she was never discharged. She died there. Don't forget newspapers. Digital newspapers are a great place to start, but remember, you need to see what kind of newspapers they have for what time period and what place. But this is a great way to find more information about that asylum. You may find an article about why the person was committed. Sometimes I did research on one person. They came out to California. They had bought some land from somebody and found out it was not what that person said. So they had a breakdown kind of in the middle of the street, and they were picked up and taken to Patton State Hospital. That was in the newspaper. So sometimes a bigger event might have been reported, especially in a small town newspaper. However, that's going to be probably more on the rare side. You're going to want to use newspapers for things like finding out more about the asylum itself. Now, we can also look at archives, government, corporate, academic, historical societies, museums, and religious. Remember, you want to think about what records might exist and where they may be held. One place to look is Online Archive of California. This is a consortium of various libraries, museums, and archives where you can find records. And they may not be digitized, so you may have to go there, but you can click on it and then you can find out more about that record set. You see that we do have that Stockton State Hospital record set, and we have Mendocino. It looks like that it includes states that wasn't in that Ancestry database. Once you find what you want, you can go up at the top and there is a collection guide where you can learn more about that collection. Archive Grid is another place to find archives and archive items. We're running out of time, so I'm going to go a little fast. Sometimes things are online. This is an example. Annual reports from 1879 to 1969 from Grafton State Hospital, Massachusetts. If you go over to the right, there's different keyword topics you can use, like psychiatric hospital, to find other records. So always look to see, there might be stuff that's available. Yes, a lot of times hospitals will say, well, it's because of HIPAA, you can't see it. But sometimes those records are stored in an archive and you can. Now, I'll tell you, like here in California, typically you have to go to court. You have to be named the executor. I know my cousin had to have her psychiatrist write something that was then, the medical records were then sent to the psychiatrist for help in diagnosing her. That's how she got access to her grandmother's records. So there are things that sometimes you have to go beyond what we're usually used to going. But if you start exhausting things like archives, then you'll know what is available and what's not. And there's an example of what's available for state hospitals. Now, let me just real quickly tell you availability. Arcadia Publishing has some books in their Images of America series on asylums. And so that might be something to check. I highly recommend these two books if you're thinking of researching asylums and people institutionalized. The Woman They Could Not Silence is going to give you a 19th century view. Annie's Ghost by Steve Luxembourg is going to give you a 20th century view. He went to a lot of work to access records, and so it's a really good kind of tutorial for genealogists. He's not a genealogist, he's an investigative reporter, but he does excellent research. Lastly, don't forget about images and how they can help you tell a story. The image I got for the beginning of this talk, I got from a report. The Asylum Postcards is a website where someone who collects asylum postcards, yes, there were postcards for asylums where they have uploaded it. You can also use Google Images to look for images that way as well, for images all over the internet. So when you're thinking about telling the story, add what you know, what you find about the individual, but also tell the story of what that experience would have been like. It's not enough to say, oh, my person was in an asylum. You have to tell the story of that asylum and what their experience was like in order to fully understand it. All right, Simone, do we have any questions or comments?
We do. This was fascinating and very comprehensive. Thank you, Gena.
You're welcome.
There was a question, are there any good books? I think we answered that one.
Yes. So do the two books that I mentioned, and then hold on just a second. Those two books. Look on Arcadia Publishing and see if the asylum that you're researching has a history. Hold on. And then go to Google and you can look in Google Books for other books as well. But I would highly recommend those two books.
Okay, thank you. Is there a handout? Is another question.
No, there is not a handout.
Have people
But
share?
so this is going to be available on YouTube, so you can watch it again and note what you missed.
Correct. And I'm going to watch it again because I think I missed a lot. So there are people sharing their stories. I want to scroll forward and take Alexis' question. I'm researching residents of the Sonoma Developmental Center buried in the unmarked cemetery over
Wonderful.
100 years ago.
Wonderful.
I've tried to get access to Sonoma County's records of custodial hearings, but have been told that my research to be approved by State of California institutional review boards. Have you experienced this with records that are so old? I'm a professor at our local university, by the way, so that would be Sonoma State.
Nice. Well, Simone, you told me that you've had people who were researching what Sonoma or Napa asylums.
We've had, I think I recognize Alexa's name now. Yeah, it's difficult. We were kind of hoping that you would know more because we get people constantly rebuffed. Yeah, is there anything you can add?
You know what? I don't have any magic wand for that. Unfortunately, some of the reasons that we are rebuffed is just kind of ridiculous, to be honest. I I think it might help to talk to someone who's already done that kind of work and see how they got in. I don't know of anybody who has for a cemetery, except that the Folsom Genealogy Society, they were actually able to get into the cemetery at Folsom Prison and they were the only ones allowed to and to record it. They may have some helpful tips about how they were able to do that, but yeah, otherwise I'm not really sure, to be honest, besides looking at all the records that you can. Some of those Sonoma records, those Sonoma records on Ancestry and the state archives have the deaths. So that should give you some of that burial information. I wonder too, Alexis, if looking at the state archives, because they gave those records that they had to Ancestry, and obviously they're available at the state archives, what the difference is between those records and then something like what Simone is talking about, what they have, if that might be another thing to look at.
Here's another question. I'm looking for records from Napa State Hospital from 1910 to 1935. I have been looking for years. Do you have any insight as where I can look next?
Okay, so did you look at the state archives? The California State Archives?
Therese can't answer, but
okay.
if you, too many messages. Here we go. Alexis.
Because I would look at the state archives, okay, and then Napa County Archives. And then once again, I would look at court records from Napa County.
Therese says yes, she has looked at, yes.
So that's the place they're going to be, is the state, the county, and then courts. So that's the places you're going to find them, unless they're still at the facility. I can't remember if Napa is still a mental health facility, but if they are, then you're never going to get access to them. So yeah, you're going to want to look at state, county, and then the court.
Alexis came back saying, we've gotten some roadblocks from state archives as well, but have managed to access some records. Thanks again.
Yeah, well, I would hope so. They gave them to Ancestry to film, so.
7, so unfortunately we have to leave. Thank you so much for your presentation, Gena, and everyone for attending and carving out an hour from your busy day. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.